to introduce to you Howard and Spieler. Am I pronouncing that correct?
Said it right the first time, Spieler.
Okay, Spieler, okay. As our guest today, and Howard is a certified sanctions specialist with over 20 years of experience in financial crime compliance, and he currently serves as the chair of the Association of Certified Sanctions Specialists. It's ACSS, and you are in New York. You're based in New York, Howard?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. He was also, and congratulations, you were recently honored with the 2025 Global Sanctions Leadership Award for your contributions to the industry. So congratulations, that's a big award there. So welcome again, Howard. We really do appreciate you sharing your time and experience with us, as compliance with sanctions is getting so challenging these days. I don't think there's been a week that hasn't gone by since 2022 that my inbox has not had some update from the EU, UN, all the various jurisdictions that are here with us today. And I'm sure it's the same with you. Are you finding that to be the case as well?
I mean, there's no question from the time I entered this profession until now, there's been a significant shift in complexity. So when I started in this field, it was, in hindsight, relatively simple. It was geographies and lists, and avoid certain jurisdictions, or I should say avoid certain countries and don't deal with anyone on a list. 2014, with the invasion of Crimea, this was the first, in my view, really complex change, in that you could not simply filter through Ukraine to get a simple answer as to whether or not there's prohibited activity, because Crimea, of course, is within Ukraine. And then there were the beginning of the SSI and the debt restrictions, and that is when, in my view, that is when things started to get complex. And then since then, of course, there's been exponential changes with respect to Russia and sanctions against Russia, and to some extent, export controls and other items that kind of focus on China. And the simple answer for that is China and Russia are too big to comprehensively sanction. That just would not work. It's not realistic. So as a matter of diplomacy, or as a matter of behavioral change through sanctions, there's been extremely creative ways to try to punish or limit certain activities, especially with respect to Russia, without cutting them off from the financial system completely, which has made people in our industry really struggle, because it is not anymore as simple as just screening names and screening countries. So yes, I agree, is a very long answer, but there's been a huge shift, and it is far more complex.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Okay, so we are going to kick up a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. So again, reminder, this is not legal advice. We hope to end it after 1 hour, and slides and recordings will be made available to all registrants. There is a certificate of attendance that will be automatically generated to all attendees of the live broadcast only. And you can, and we encourage you to use the question box to post questions. I will be monitoring the questions, and anything that's relevant to a particular slide, I will ask Howard, or we'll wait until the end for any other questions. And again, I've also made the announcement about the new course that I found on the Know Your Country website for country AML risk assessment. So if you are needing more training in that area, please do visit that website.
If I could just jump in for a second.
Sorry,
just
go ahead.
In terms of housekeeping, I also want to say, any views or opinions I make are mine, not necessarily those of my employer or the organization I volunteer for, or anyone else. I am here, these are my own opinions, my own views, and don't reflect anyone else's. I just need to make that clear.
Yeah, thank you. And a couple of polling questions so that Howard can get a good feel for our audience. And I'm going to turn off my camera now so that people can focus on our slides. Howard, you are welcome to also turn yours off if you would like to. And I'm going to just turn mine off. So
yes.
All right. So this.
Sorry, I will also turn off my camera. So.
Okay. So how would you describe your current level of sanctions knowledge? And again, I have been in compliance for well over, 20 years, 21 years now. And I would say I am intermediate / beginner, just to give you an idea of it's okay if you feel like you are very much a beginner. 20 years of compliance experience, I am too. I think anybody who's probably an expert, that is probably your full-time job, which is great because we need some experts in this field. So yeah, so we are now showing about 50% are saying intermediate. That's good. And 45% are saying beginner. We've got about 4% saying that they are expert. So does that help you understand the audience a little bit better?
It does, thank you. The challenge with doing any type of presentation is trying to resonate with everyone. If you go into too much detail, the beginners might not follow, or it could be too simple for the experts. So this is a pretty good mix, and for the 8 experts, I invite them to they can turn on their camera and join me, or they can ping me with their thoughts. I'm just joking. I'm going to try to. I always try to speak to the lowest common denominator, so I'm going to really try to explain things as best I could for the beginners while giving some additional detail. Otherwise, it could get a little complicated. But yeah, provide feedback through the Q&A if there's more or less detail needed, and I'm happy to adjust.
Okay. And I have, so we're now on polling question number 2, and that would be, oops, I think I messed up the slides. Actually, it's not how would you describe your current sanctions knowledge. The polling question number 2 is which industry best describes your organization? And I have split it up so those who are in traditional financial services such as banks, insurance, think of payment processors with the exception of VAS, anything digital assets. The other one is trust and corporate services, or if you're in professional services, or if you're virtual assets or digital assets, because I think they have a little bit of a different complexity there. And then other, you might be regulators, or you might be technology or other solutions. So yeah, so we have currently, okay, a really good mix. We've got 33% traditional financial services, 34% trust and corporate services, 21% professional services, 4% virtual or digital assets, so VAS, and then 8% of others. Does that help you out?
That does.
So,
very, very interesting. It's usually dominated by financial services, so it's a very interesting mix.
Very interesting, yes, yeah. And of course, Howard, again, being based in the US, you might not realize that in other parts of the world, in the rest of the world, law firms do fall under some, or many law firms fall under AML regulations and have to do due diligence and submit SARs. That is not the case in the US, so you might be a bit surprised to see that law firms and accounting firms, have to do, fall under some elements of AML in many other countries. All right, so we can close those polls. Thank you very much. And we're going to move on. And again, thank you, Howard, in advance for sharing your experience with us. And I'm going to let you kick off.
Great. So we're going to try to cover 3 broad themes here. The first is the current landscape for sanctions and to some extent export controls globally. Just really an overview of current events and what's happening, and the regulatory divergence, where the focus of US, UK, and EU sanctions regimes appear to be heading, at least based on enforcement designations and advisories. And then we'll quickly run through some best practices, which are, usually applicable for all these scenarios, and we'll go through it more at the end. And we'll make sure we leave time for questions as well. I guess the next slide, if you don't mind. So here's a quick overview of what I consider the kind of hot or relevant topics, and we have a slide to go into more detail for each. There's been a lot of news around BIS's 50% rule, which is, I believe, actually called the affiliates rule. BIS is it's essentially export controls. There's been an expansion for similar to how SDN ownership is viewed in the US, in that if 50% or more of an entity is owned, not owned and controlled, just owned by an SDN in aggregate, then the entity in question is designated. That rule has been adopted by BIS for export controls, which makes sense, and it's consistent. It just greatly expands the number of entities on the list and the due diligence that's required. So this expands the two lists. There's the military end user list, the MEU, or Commerce's entity list. Both these lists are affected. It's designed to be consistent with Department of Treasury. Of course, OFAC is part of the Department of Treasury. There was some confusion in the original press release, as I understand it. So the rule's effective September 29th. I got this right from the announcement, but I believe the initial press release did not say that. This was brought to my attention by somebody. So if that's a matter of confusion for anyone, and this is all available online, the rule is already in effect. There's been a huge focus on cartels. And I do think, based on the number of registrants that, my understanding, are in Cayman Islands or Caribbean, this should be, I think, even more relevant. This is an absolute focus of the administration, the cartels. First and foremost, and most significant, in the very beginning of the administration, I believe it was January 20th, there are certain cartels that were designated as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs. The initial reaction was, really, what's the big deal? They're already SDNs, and you can't do business with SDNs if you have a US nexus. What's very significant about this designation is that providing material support or resources, right, and put that in quotes, to a foreign terrorist organization could also be a criminal offense. It also involves Department of Justice. It could also involve criminal liability and prosecution. So the underlying risk is very significant. Furthermore, material support or resources, as I understand it, could be interpreted, can you go back? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Could be interpreted very broadly. So, for example, servicing accounts or transacting with an organization that may be affiliated with a cartel could be viewed as providing material support. So, for example, if you have if you're financial services or professional services, and your client is a dry cleaner, and it turns out that dry cleaner is owned by a shell company that's owned by cartel or cartel member, by servicing that account, it could be viewed as providing material support to the cartel, to the terrorist organization, and there could be significant penalties around that. So that really broadens the risk. It makes knowing your client beneficial ownership and understanding the ownership structure in these jurisdictions, which is going to be primarily Mexico, of utmost importance. And that's a critical point, is that the providing material support or resources is a huge hammer that the government, the US government, could wield. So there's potential criminal liability for employees or officers of anyone in the transaction chain. Now, the DOJ, Department of Justice, standard around the material support or resources is should have known, right? So based on the facts presented, should you have known? So number one, if there's information in front of you that could have been used to make this determination that's not used, certainly the US government could view that you should have known. But this also means willful blindness is not an excuse. So not asking the right questions and then saying there's no way for us to know would not be, as I understand it, an excuse through the eyes of the US government. You have to ask the right questions and you have to follow up where needed. So the should have known standard is really twofold. If you're getting information, you need to look at it. You need to follow up if there's any issues, and willful blindness will not be a viable excuse. So big focus of the administration. The current administration is very clear. You know, they do what they say and they say what they do. And cartels are a focus, and the actions completely support that. So FTO designation of cartels really brings a new level of risk and underscores the importance of, you know, understanding your clients, especially if it's in a high risk jurisdiction such as Mexico. So we can go to the next slide.
Okay. Sorry, there you go.
So related to the cartels is fentanyl. Fentanyl is a huge money maker, billions of dollars for the cartels. So this goes hand in hand with the focus on FTOs, or focus on the cartels, is fentanyl. That's fentanyl production, fentanyl shipping, precursor chemicals, and then the subsequent smuggling of the fentanyl into the US, which is further sold. There's, you know, been various legislation that's passed, such as the whole Fentanyl Act and others. And this is really hand in hand with the pressure around the cartels. In addition to China's role as a part of the supply chain for fentanyl, in terms of selling the chemicals that are used to make fentanyl, there's been a shift in the past several years through India. So India is also selling chemicals. They're selling chemicals online, and there's an entire smuggling network from India to China to Mexico, which would be worthy of its own separate webinar. So I don't have time to get into it now, but I think the significant point here is Mexico, China transactions, in my view, should be looked at closely. Underlying products, if you have shipments of chemicals from China going to Mexico, it's probably worth a closer look. Just understand the risk, understand the products, and understand that this is the absolute focus of the US government. There's also an advisory around some ports on the west coast of Mexico, which are controlled by the cartels, which is how, you know, the chemicals are smuggled in. There's also FinCEN designations against 3 Mexican banks. This is all part of the much broader initiative around, you know, dismantling the cartels and their money network involving fentanyl production and smuggling. So before I switch to Iran, if there's any questions on those 2 slides specifically, maybe I'm happy to tackle it, Kimberly.
Yeah, no questions from the audience that's coming in. I was thinking when you mentioned about the Mexican ports, though, is insurers. That I do work with some insurers who insure ships. Would they want to be looking at, like, I guess the travel of where their ships are going, and if any are in certain higher risk ports, potentially helping to smuggle those things? So they might not actually see transactions between, as you say, China and India, but they might have ports. I mean, do you kind of see that kind of monitoring going on in your world?
If I worked at an insurance company, I certainly would not want to insure any shipments or cargo of chemicals from China to Mexico without understanding what's there. You just don't want to be part of that transaction. And certainly with the FTO designation and providing material support, that just expands the scope and reach. So I just think it's important to understand the risk, regardless of whether you're a financial institution or a law firm or insurance. understanding that the U.S. government is extremely focused on dismantling cartels and stopping the importation of fentanyl and all parts of the supply chain through it, including apparently India sells these readily available chemicals on eBay, on the dark net. There was an operation last year where I think 1,500 packages were inspected from India, and 300 of them had chemicals in them. So the U.S. government is laser focused on this, and there should certainly be an assessment of risk based on each company's activities onto if there's any potential of this underlying behavior.
Okay. And just so you know, for those who are asking things like, what are the names of the 3 banks, Howard has been very good. We have a list of, he provided a list of the resources, and at the end of these slides, they will be available to you. And I'm sure, do you remember the names of those 3 banks, Howard? Just off the top of your head?
I really should, but I don't. But if one quick Google search of, FinCEN Mexican banks or something, we'll pull it right up.
Okay, great.
And if there's no link, if there's no link in the back, because I used a lot of resources, if there's no link in the back, everything that's on here is public information. There's not a single item on this list that can't be traced back to something public. There's no magic or secret sauce here. It's all public information, just kind of consolidated into these slides.
Okay. And there are some other questions, but I'm going to save these to the end just so we can make sure we get through the topic here. But there's some very good questions coming in.
Okay.
Okay.
Another focus of the U.S. government has been Iran. So there's a publicly stated maximum pressure on Iran. Seems like a long time ago, right? But there was a military strike by the U.S. in Iran. I mean, that has moved in and out of the news very quickly, but still noteworthy. A strike on Iranian soil, right? Iran designations have been fast and furious. They span multiple countries, right? Extraterritorial reach of the U.S. government. So there's been designations for non-Iranian companies for dealing with them, typically around oil and shipping, diversion of Iranian oil, but also missile and weapons programs, as well as human rights violations. There were I highlighted 3 recent enforcements by U.S. government, but there's more. So in July, there was a shipping conglomerate, which I believe is a Greek citizen or a Greek shipping company, but apparently has ties to the son of an advisor to the Iranian supreme leader. So there were targets there. In September, there were targets for companies based in Hong Kong and the UAE for illicitly selling Iranian oil. And then more recently in October, that there was a variety of sanctions on companies, individuals that are supplying, either directly supplying materials or supporting materials for Iran's missile program or military aircraft. So again, a lot of news the past 6 months. There's a lot that's going on. In my view, the cartel and fentanyl has been probably the biggest topic, but Iran is right behind it. It just hasn't been in the news very recently, but still exists. I would imagine, most companies, most entities, most individuals are already well aware of their Iranian exposure, if any. And of course, they've been very long sanctioned. So, the cartel designations and some of the fentanyl production stuff, that's a little bit more nuanced and a little new. This is more just a reminder that the U.S. government is also very focused on Iran. Also worth mentioning, and again, I don't feel like this gets a ton of news. The U.S. military has blown up several Venezuelan vessels suspected of trafficking drugs. Historically, my understanding is this is done usually by Coast Guard seizures. maybe in coordination with others in international waters. But these are just military strikes. I mean, that is a very significant escalation and certainly a risk. There's been reports that President Trump declared to Congress in a memo that we're in a non-international armed conflict with drug cartels, right? So that goes back to the first slide, right? Just to underscore the focus there. There's been a buildup of the U.S. military throughout the Southern Caribbean, and again, I think this is relevant to many people on this call. There's been movements of aircrafts in Puerto Rico. There's warships, and I didn't know this until I actually came across it myself doing research, but a nuclear-powered submarine has been moved into the region as well. So there is a lot of posturing here and certainly aggressive actions. If I had to guess, if I was put on the spot and said, what do you think is the next country that could be potentially comprehensively sanctioned, it would be Venezuela. I'm not saying that's going to happen, and I certainly have no insight, but I was asked that question recently, right? If I had a gun to my head and said, pick a country, Venezuela has been certainly in the sights. There's also apparently, and again, I did not realize this till I was doing research, there's a $50 million reward for anyone who, for information or actually carries out an arrest of Maduro, president of Venezuela. Completely off the radar. I was surprised to hear that. That's a lot of money. But all of this is, clearly, I think, underscoring the broader administration's focus on cartels, on drugs, on any illicit activity. But there's been a little extra focus on Venezuela that I also think is just lost in the headlines with so much that's going on, not just in the US, but globally. But certainly, in my view, think transactions with Venezuela carry increased risk. I think, I think if a company was dealing with Venezuela that turned out to have some sort of nexus or transaction to drugs, to a gang, there was a Venezuelan gang that was recently added to the SDN list. Even if it's not cartel related, you don't want anything to do with that transaction, in my opinion. So certainly would be cautious with Venezuelan transactions. From a U.S. perspective, there's been sanctions against the government, against oil, gold, various sanctions against Venezuela, short of comprehensive sanctions for humanitarian reasons at the time. That was the specific, and I believe it was the Obama administration that very intentionally said, we do not want comprehensive sanctions. We don't want to affect the everyday lives of Venezuelan citizens. This is really about the government and the government's behavior. So, there's risk in Venezuela, and I would personally consider it to present elevated sanctions risk if you have Venezuelan-based clients or transactions to or from Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. And I can definitely see that the Venezuela landscape for the U.S. is definitely going to impact a lot of our audience members. As a matter of fact, just do a quick thumbs up if Venezuela is one of your biggest concerns right now. If you guys are listening in, yeah, I got a few. Yeah, got some thumbs down. I guess, is that the same thing? But yeah, a lot of people are kind of more concerned. And there's a couple of questions, but again, we will look at those at the end.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of this, as always, is, it is very difficult to be risk-free. You have to make best efforts to mitigate risk-based approach, understanding your risk and addressing it. In my view, Venezuela presents elevated risk and should be researched and, proper due diligence that's done. There are certainly legal transactions that could be done with Venezuela. It's all about risk, right? We live in a world where every single client and every single transaction can't receive the same exact focus. That's nearly impossible. I guess maybe someday with AI it will be. So it's a risk-based approach, right? And in my personal opinion, Venezuela presents elevated risk as a non-comprehensively sanctioned country. There is still risk there. So moving on to the UK. So the UK and the EU far more focused on Russia and to some extent Iran. And I don't really see anything about cartels or drugs. Not that they don't care, but it's not the same focus. Geographically, kind of makes sense, right? So a lot of these activities in Mexico is obviously on the U.S. border, whereas Russia is in Europe's backyard. So certainly makes sense. But there's been a much bigger focus, in my opinion, from the UK and the EU around Russia. I just highlighted a couple of monetary penalties by OFSI, both involving transactions with Russian entities or unlawful or prohibited transactions. So I have a chart on this later. The fines in the UK, while they're certainly significant if you're the company being fined, they're less than what's typically fined in the US. And historically, nothing comes close to the penalties that the US have imposed in the past 10 or 15 years, multiple billions of dollars. But the UK is certainly heading in that direction, which is kind of the point I'm trying to make here, is that the UK is starting to ramp up its enforcement. They're starting to impose fines, and they're predominantly Russia related. And again, it's all available on the OFSI website, so if the link isn't there, just Google it, it's all there. We go to the next slide. I just thought this was kind of interesting that OFSI went out of its way to note two failures or delays in responding to requests. So in the first one, there was just a broad RFI to a bunch of charities. Apparently some register had outdated email addresses. They never responded. OFAC considered this a breach, but didn't impose any monetary penalties. Then several months later, they publicly fined and named and shamed this shipping company for not responding to their RFI, even going so far to publicly say that the company only responded after OFSI contacted their auditors, because their contact to the company itself, which is being ignored. And they made a pretty big deal out of it, saying even so much that they failed to provide a reasonable excuse for missing the deadline. So if you get, if you receive a request from OFSI, make sure it's responded to quickly, because they seemed extremely focused on making a public statement out of this, including a fine. So.
And just a quick question: is that shipping and trading company? Is that a UK company? I'm assuming.
Yes.
Okay.
Without looking it up on the spot, that is my understanding. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. I would think it is, because I would think that's where their authority lies, but maybe not.
Yeah. I was just kind of wondering. And just for those who don't know, RFI stands for Request for Information. So a seemingly kind of simple request, and yeah, they get that fine. Okay.
Yes,
Do you want me to move on to the next slide? Yeah.
Please.
All right.
So the European Union, they continue to be focused on Russia. So this year, they adopted the 18th package. That was in July. There were transaction bans around Nord Stream 1 and 2, which are pipelines. There were additional restrictions on advanced technologies and other exports, typically dual-use goods. Dual-use goods generally means something that can be used for military, even if it's not necessarily used for military. So in the US, something like night vision goggles or drones, and you could buy a drone from Amazon, right? It's not like buying a machine gun, but drones, we know, are being used by Russia to launch bombs into apartment buildings in Kyiv. So there's a focus on the type of technologies, both from the EU, UK, and US perspective, around what kind of goods are being shipped. It's really complicated. There are various codes. Normally, this would be something that's viewed at in trade finance transactions where there's very detailed lists of cargo, bills of lading, certificate of origin, end use. For transactions for a simple wire, that information might not be available as to what the underlying purchase is. But think back to the knowledge standard. If there's in my opinion, if there's a wire and that wire says shipment of drones with explosive devices to Moscow, well, then the government, any of these authorities would say, well, you should have known, it says it right there. So, just important to be careful about, what information you have, and just keeping in mind that there are, very significant export controls and trade restrictive measures imposed unilaterally by US, EU, and UK with respect to Russia, also China, but really the EU is laser focused on Russia. Also, this last point, I just think it's worth highlighting because it is just not talked about often enough. Russia is accused of kidnapping children, taking children, and putting them through military education. It's in quotes because that's what it's called. There was a designation by, I believe it was the US last week, for a Russian general who's in charge of like these re-education camps. It seems to me to be, it's an absolutely outrageous and egregious human rights violation. Just not talked about that much. I just kind of wanted to bring that to everyone's awareness that there is, some, if these reports are true, these are some horrific things that are happening around, essentially re-educating children in the middle of a war. So it's all Googleable. Look it up. I just kind of wanted to highlight that because it was very surprising to me.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that actually.
So the EU has also proposed a 19th Russian package. Not sure off the top of my head when that's expected to come out. It's going to be focused on Russian energy, specifically LNG, liquid natural gas. Right, so there's been long sanctions against Russian oil, Russian steel production, certain minerals. Europe, as I understand it, is still using Russian energy, and they're going to be challenged to find a different method if this goes through. Also, and this is highlighted to the right from a news clipping, this is the EU, who's long complained about the US extraterritoriality, right? Secondary sanctions. They're now proposing non-Russian companies be subject to EU sanctions, including firms from the UAE and some of other Eastern European nations. So scope is expanding. There's a lot of risk around Russian energy. Some of the targets, in addition to Russian energy companies and financial institutions, crypto, there's crypto exchanges that are being accused of supporting Russia's military. And as always, tankers, and I have a separate slide to talk about tankers, but there's been a lot of activity around tankers, oil tankers, right? Essentially ships that are designed to carry large amounts of oil around the world, which is really one of the highest risk transactions or activities right now. Anything in that part of the world that's carrying oil has a tremendous amount of risk around it. So don't talk about UN sanctions that often, because many jurisdictions, there's a lot of overlap between UN sanctions and the big three, EU, UK, and US, and they don't always align. But this, in my opinion, is significant because it changes the posture for some Western European countries to align more with the US position on Iran, which is relatively new. So it's been referred to as a snapback on Iranian sanctions. So the UN reimposed sanctions around Iran that were waived as part of the JCPOA, which is probably 10 years old at this point, if not more. So the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was, many Western European countries in the US under the Obama administration to lift certainly not all sanctions against Iran in exchange for their commitment not to build, nuclear technology, nuclear weapons. It was built in a way that Russia and China could not veto it. So one of the issues with the UN is that Russia and China are voting members. They tend to vote together, and it's hard to impose sanctions on anything Russia and China related when they have a veto. So this particular effort for the snapback was led by what's being known as the E3, France, Germany, and the UK. And it brings some of the UN sanctions back around arms and ballistic missile technology, travel bans, etc. So I think there's always been a lot of risk around Iranian transactions. To me, this is just more about kind of a culture shift and focus from Western European countries that were fully committed and supportive of the JCPOA even after the US pulled out of it in first Trump administration, are now behind this, and in agreement and voted for this snapback. So a lot of risk, obviously, still around Iranian transactions, not just from the US. A lot of companies adopt UN sanctions instead of developing their own sanctions programs and regimes. So if you represent or work in a country that follows the UN sanctions, then if you weren't aware, you should know that there's additional risk now around transactions with Iran. So I want to give a shout out to one of my partners, a firm called Castellum.ai. They helped me come up with these slides based on data they sourced. So as a thank you for them for helping me with this deck, I'd like to just encourage everyone to follow them on LinkedIn and check them out. They put out a lot of great content and a lot of really good statistics and analysis. So I believe some of them are on. So thank you for putting these slides together for me. So I like pictures and I like numbers, right? Because they tell a story. So I just spent 25 minutes talking about culture shifts, enforcement actions, sanctions. So let's see what the numbers say. Well, you look at the EU and you look at the UK and you look in green, it looks by my eye, at least 50% of their designations are Russia related. I think it's very clear. Now look at the third and look at about what looks like 65 or 70% of the designations, Iran. I don't even see Russia on the US chart, right? So everything I just said, based on public statements, based on enforcement actions, based on advisories, based on headlines, based on rhetoric, it's all bearing out in the numbers here. The EU and the UK continue to be extremely focused on Russia. Of course, that does not mean they don't care about drug trafficking, human rights violations, Iranian missile technology. They do. But in terms of just setting the picture of what's happening globally, Russia continues to be the focus of the EU and the UK. They certainly don't want a huge regional war spilling over to their borders. US, very focused on Iran, and you see second is terrorism. And my guess is a lot of that terrorism is FTO cartel related. And even the third slice of this pie here in the US, illicit drugs. So again, US perspective, US nexus, Iran, cartels, drugs, EU and UK, Russia designations, diversion, sanctions evasion, parts, products.
I'm looking at this, and I would love to see if Castellum.ai, I don't know if they can do this or not, go back like 10 years and redo these charts and show the movement of over the past 10 years of like, what did we focus on 10 years ago? And then how quickly how much has changed and how constantly it's changed just over the past 10 years. I think that'd just be be fascinating. And I agree with you. These are great charts. It really shows
Yeah,
you the difference of Belarus. I mean, like Belarus for EU, it's a big chunk. I don't even see any blue on the US. Um, well, that's
yeah.
interesting. Great slides.
Probably worthy
Great.
of its own separate webinar to just go through these numbers and the impacts, and I'm sure they could do it. So
Yeah, and here's the thing, here's the challenge that we face in the Caribbean and any of the international, slash offshore, jurisdictions. So we're doing a lot of international complex transactions, or those are the clients. So EU, UK, US, it's in UN, they have to look at all of them. It's simple in the US, it seems like you just have to look at US sanctions. But when you're in these smaller international financial centers, you have to look at all four, and more if you're dealing with, different currencies. It's fascinating. And it's hugely complex for these smaller firms.
yep. So I just took a look at the time, and I see that we still have a lot to cover. So I'm going to try to flip through these. You're gonna send these out, so a lot of them are self-explanatory. So here's just the numbers in a little bit more detail. So we could flip through these pretty quickly, Kimberly. So EU,
Okay.
again, Russia, clearly more than everything else combined. UK, I would also say Russia is probably more than everything else combined.
Yeah.
In the US, again, Iran. So this is just a deeper dive into what we just saw.
There's one, you have cyber in there. Is that cyber, human trafficking, human rights? Because they're not about specific countries. So these are just certain players that have cyber attacks, human trafficking attacks.
Probably more like entities that are involved in cyber attacks, supporting them, facilitating them. The same with the human trafficking, which
Okay.
seems to be very closely related to human rights. I guess in the UK, they're different.
Okay.
So again, I don't think we have to belabor this point anymore about Iran and cartels and drugs.
So we're on the 2025 sanctions by type.
Yeah, so this is globally. What's notable here to me are the vessels, and I think we have a follow-up slide just on vessels.
Yes.
So if we look here, so the past 2 years looks like, I don't know, 400, 450 vessels, typically tankers, have been designated, which is really equal to everything that was designated prior, right? There's been a huge focus on designating and identifying vessels. If you haven't, I would suggest Googling the shadow fleet. There's been a couple of companies that have done really good work around what they call the shadow fleet. So these are non-designated vessels that, based on their information, are likely carrying or suspected of carrying illicit oil. It's very complicated analysis that they do around transponder tracking, who's turning off their transponders. Ships go dark when they go near the Russian coast, and then they come back on, and then they go to India or China. So India and China very publicly are still buying Russian oil. So there's a lot of interesting information on the web, or through LinkedIn. I get a lot of my sanctions news and updates through LinkedIn. If you look up the shadow fleet, there's a lot of good information there. But the broader point here is there's a lot of focus around vessels, targeting vessels, and sanctioning vessels, especially in these high-risk regions. So if your firm, whether you provide financial services, insurance, professional services, if you're not checking the names of the ships that you're dealing with, the IMO number, think of it as like a VIN number for ships. You certainly should be, to better understand your risk, also understand where they're docking to and from, whether they're on any lists or even any shadow fleet lists. But in my opinion, any transaction involving an oil tanker that's not, strictly domestic, maybe from, Texas to the Cayman Islands directly or something, there's risk there. And of course, Venezuelan oil is also subject to sanctions. So this, in my opinion, is definitely a high risk activity and something worth noting. But the bigger takeaway here is just a lot of vessels that's designated, and make sure you're doing due diligence on any shipping transaction to mitigate any potential risk and, document it.
Okay.
Here's just another very cool map by Castellum. I think speaks for itself, right? We got Mexico highlighted in red to the left, and Russia and China to the right. It should be not much of a surprise where these designations are falling.
Yeah, and I am a little surprised to see India kind of more colored on that map too. And this is just in 2025, so just in the past 9 months, 10 months.
Yeah, and I think it kind of makes sense. India is dealing with Russian oil. They're accused of fentanyl production and dealing with chemicals. Don't normally think of India as necessarily high risk from a sanctions perspective, but given their public, and again, all Googleable, given the fact that they continue to buy Russian oil. And I think a couple of weeks ago, there was a summit between the presidents of China, Russia, and India, right? Modi and Putin, and I think they took a picture together holding hands. So there's definitely some additional sanctions risk in India that a couple of years ago I certainly wouldn't have personally, viewed them as presenting elevated risk. But if it's involving, pharmaceuticals or the energy industry, I think it's worthy of additional due diligence. There is some risk there. So that's a good call out. Kimberly, thank you.
All right, so we got another polling question. Does your institution have a dedicated export control review function? And for those of you who are not familiar with export control reviews, what Howard's asking is, do you have a structured way of checking whether the services or structures or transactions you're facilitating could be caught by U.S. export controls or sanctions rules, not just traditional goods exports? I was actually speaking to my nephew who works for a manufacturer of private jets, and he has to travel a lot between China and France and the UK. Now I was asking him how his company, a manufacturing company, did, because that would be dual-use goods, all these private jet parts. He goes, they had an entire team, specialized team, that's all they did. And I thought that was very fascinating. I was just like, oh, that's interesting. So for those of you, again, it's like if you're providing some service or doing some transactions, and you think most larger institutions do have a dedicated team. And I'm curious if, okay, so right now, dedicated export control, because it's so complex, only 7% are saying yes.
It's actually higher. Yes, it's higher than I would have thought, to be honest.
Yeah, okay.
Most, based on my informal conversations with other professionals in financial crime, because of the more recent focus on export controls, many sanctions team members and in some cases, AML team members and investigators have had to learn export controls relatively quickly. Think, freight forwarders, shippers, certainly, airplane manufacturers, they probably have teams, dozens of internal and external lawyers to cover export controls because they're actually exporters. But financial services can be implicated and someday may even be subject to an enforcement if they're part of any type of export control violation. So it's like a big chatter in the industry, based on my conversations, is sanctions teams ramping up to get more familiar with export controls, and kind of leveraging the ecosystem of sanctions teams and investigators to include export controls. And maybe one day in the future, just like there's an AML pillar and a sanctions pillar, maybe financial institutions will have an export control pillar. Don't know, but worth just highlighting the risk to everyone. There's a lot of public statements by well, first of all, there was an advisory at the end of the Biden administration around it was guidance, best practices for financial institutions. That was not rescinded by the Trump administration. Other executive orders and regulations were. That was not. So I took that as the incoming administration was also interested or wanted to ensure that financial institutions are at least paying attention to export controls. And then, of course, the affiliate rule, the 50% rule that was passed last week. So there is risk there. Don't sleep on it. Okay, so I think we're going to have to probably go through these slides a little faster, Kimberly.
Yeah.
So by regulatory divergence, this is just continuing to highlight the difference in the approaches versus the US, the EU, the UK. Everybody should be mindful of potential conflicts of law issues, which could happen. There are, different understandings of ownership and control. So here, this is available on the OFAC website. So $250 million in penalties and settlements over 9 enforcement cases this year. I think we could move on. These are all available on the OFAC website for more information. OFAC has long been, aggressive with its penalties. Continuing maximum pressure on Iran on October 1st, right? So it was a little bit over a week ago. There was there were designations that covered 7 countries, including, not just Iran and China. You have Portugal, you have Germany, right? You have countries you don't normally think of with, supporting or diverting arms or goods to Iran. So the extraterritoriality continues. A lot of risk. You want to understand if your client or transactions that you're looking at have any nexus to Iran.
Came on the site on Houthis.
Yeah, so really quickly, again, way out of the news, but if you remember, Houthis were attacking commercial ships, sinking them. U.S. government had military strikes in response. There were multiple SDNs around, the Houthis, including the International Bank of Yemen. Iran is accused of supporting and funding the Houthis, and I believe the Saudis support the other side. So it's essentially, a bit of a proxy war. I guess the broader takeaway, Yemen, there's risk there. There are still, it's not necessarily safe right now for ships to pass through these waters. So additional risk there, something I just wanted to flag. Yeah, we can move on.
Yes, it's UK, EU.
Yep. So just kind of a summary of what we talked about before. The EU is still focused on Russia. They've updated their high priority list, which ties back to export controls. I wanted to just take a step back and talk a little bit about these transactions or global companies or clients that cover multiple jurisdictions. So OFAC ownership is defined as 50% or more. It's applicable to the entity list, the military end user list, the SDN list. In the EU and UK, it's not just ownership, it's ownership and control. So it is much more difficult, in my opinion, to figure out who a controlling interest is. So if a company is, I don't know, 10% owned by a sanctioned entity, but um, they control more than half of the voting board of directors, then there's an argument that they actually control that entity, and that entity, while not on a sanctions list, would be prohibited from a EU and UK perspective. So it's just another layer of complexity, and unfortunately, a inconsistency between Europe and the UK and the US. There are blocking statutes. These are typically in the EU or UK about not complying with US sanctions, and there could be serious consequences. This creates conflict of law complications if you have a subsidiary in a country that has a blocking statute, and for example, something would be prohibited from a US perspective, but that local country doesn't follow US sanctions. That's something that I would personally advise needs to go, directly to your legal teams to navigate. It's not uncommon. There have been not many, but there's a few enforcements that were done. I believe maybe one, maybe two in the EU, but it's on the books and it could happen. There's definitely restrictions in Russia for applying US sanctions. So for companies that are still, have operations in Russia, there's also a lot of risk there for obvious reasons. So just something to think about when you're dealing, with global companies in multiple jurisdictions. It's incredibly complicated.
That slide right here is a whole day workshop right there. I could tell you it's way more complicated than we think. All right.
Also, maybe worthy of its own webinar.
Well, I was gonna say, not even a 1 hour webinar. It would have to be almost a half day, at least a half day workshop. It's just, it's like I say, you could run through so many scenarios. Sorry, we are at top of the hour. So, are you able to stay on for another 10 minutes to answer any questions?
Yeah, let me just quickly double check that. Yes, I could.
Okay.
I could go till the for another 10 minutes, sure. So just to summarize some best practices here, because while we covered a lot, we barely scratched the surface of what's going on. These were just high-level themes as to what's happening in the current state. The EU, the UK, OFAC for sure, they have regulatory guidance, a lot of it. So for example, framework for OFAC compliance commitments lays out their expectations. OFAC also lays out its expectations in their enforcements. This is all public. The EU and the UK have something similar. Go right to the source. They're telling you what they want you to do. Customer due diligence, that's always been important. Beneficial ownership, that's always been important. But especially with these cartel-related transactions, with foreign terrorist organizations, with potential criminal liability and the U.S. Department of Justice, it makes it even more important. If based on your risk-based approach and your internal risk appetite and risk assessment, you want to ensure you know who you're dealing with. That's always been the case, but it's really even more important. And to that end, you should always be performing a risk assessment or an assessment of risk. What are your high-risk geographies? Which we talked about a couple, right? India, Yemen, Venezuela, Mexico, not necessarily comprehensively sanctioned, but subject to sanctions. And there's a big difference there. High-risk products, chemicals coming from India or China to Mexico, pill pressers. There's anything related to oil. Obviously, these are products that carry high risk. Therefore, clients that deal in these products or transactions that involve these products are likely due to additional due diligence. Know who your high-risk clients are. If they're based in one of these geographies, it might be worth digging a little deeper into understanding their ownership structure. Third-party due diligence. You could have a client and a vendor in low-risk jurisdictions, and in the middle of that supply chain could be extremely high risk. It could be India, it could be any of the countries we've mentioned. So you want to understand the, the supply chain of the underlying transaction or who your client is dealing with, and even your own vendors. You want to understand and certainly due diligence with your vendors. Many people screen their vendors against sanctions lists and check their locations. It happens, I've seen it. And the knowledge standard, on top of all the other due diligence requirements, willful blindness is not going to be acceptable. So there's the standard that, should you have known, if information falls in your lap, you need to act on it. And if you're not asking the right questions, consider doing so. Same, using a risk-based approach. If you're dealing with a farming company in Iowa, do you need to ask them questions about fentanyl protection? Maybe not. But if you have clients that are dealing with pharmaceuticals to or from India, then perhaps you want to ask those questions. Otherwise, you could be in a position where you should have known but didn't ask. And again, for anyone who dialed in late, any of these opinions are my own, not that of my employer or anyone I work with or for. And of course, this is not legal advice, most especially because I'm not a lawyer, so it's really not legal advice. I know Kimberly covered this at the top, but I just wanted to reemphasize that. And happy to open it up for questions.
Yeah, okay. Lots of great questions. And we've got 3 minutes, so we won't be able to answer all of them. Ken, you've asked a question. I've got a article. It's not an article, it's something that I was my own research, so I will get to you. And he was asking about OFAC sanctions on Caribbean countries. It's the fact that it's so much is in US dollars. And I won't go into it, but because of the US dollar impact, that's the reason why the OFAC list, the US OFAC list has that reach into non-US countries. There's some other questions I will get to. Those of you, some of you, Shonda, I will get to you privately. I saw your question. And the one person has asked a very good question, and we have not mentioned this country, is Israel. They're saying, what are your thoughts? How would you, we don't have, no one's sanctioning Israel, I don't think. But how is that kind of impacted in your view?
So I believe there have been some designations within Israel, at least from a U.S. perspective. There's, I don't know if I consider it high risk from a sanctions perspective. One thing to be careful of with Israel from a U.S. perspective are U.S. anti-boycott rules. So very high level, the U.S. government does not support boycotts of other countries. And there are many Gulf states that have standard in their contract language about not dealing with Israel. As a US person, I would not want to be party to a contract with a client who has put into their contract that they won't deal with Israel. I am not a boycott legislation expert, but my understanding is that potentially could be, violative activity. So I don't think there's much sanctions risk, certainly from a U.S. perspective around Israel. Would kind of Google U.S. boycott, that's actually U.S. anti-boycott laws about U.S. companies not permitted to participate in boycotts by other countries. But that's usually my understanding is that's most relevant Gulf states in Israel. So.
Okay. We're going to have to end here. Great questions. Again, their own webinar topic. People are asking about, briefly summarize ownership threshold. I'm not asking you to do so, though, Howard. I think that's more of a specialist, somebody who has UK and EU experience. People are asking about willful blindness. That is also a legal question in my mind, so I will not ask you that. I think a lawyer needs to answer those kinds of questions. And maybe we could get somebody on to talk about that. But in my experience, a willful blindness would be like you're just not screening at all. But again, that's more of a legal question.
Right. You can't bury your head in the sand and then say, well, I had no idea, right?
Exactly,
So,
exactly.
right. I mean, you could spend any one of these slides could be an all-day topic, right? But
Oh, absolutely.
a lot of this information, there's so much content out there by law firms, consultants. A lot of this information is out there publicly. None of it is legal advice, of course, but willful blindness definition might change by jurisdiction. I agree with you, Kimberly, but I think the questions are good in that we want people to understand themes, right? Where's the risk? It's all about risk mitigation, risk-based approach. Understand the risks involved around what questions you're asking and not asking, what geographies and clients pose higher risk than others. And you want to have a risk-based approach and document it. And the questions, I think, show that hopefully the broader themes are resonating, because that's all we could do in an hour, I think, is just kind of lay out what's happening and what the impacts have been for people that failed.
Yeah, yeah. And again, thank you. And you do have references, and these will be on the slides that we do, attached to the recording. And again, Howard, thank you so much. I hope you don't mind. I forgot to tell you, I put your LinkedIn, if people wanted to follow you on LinkedIn. Is that okay?
Of course.
I hope so, because I've just done it. And we're already getting a lot of people saying thank you. So many people are still staying on even 10 minutes past the hour. So they're very, very appreciative of your advice. Lots of thumbs up coming through. I don't know if you can see those. This is very, very helpful, Howard. Again, I appreciate your time. I wish I'd had something like this whenever I was a compliance officer and learning, just kind of getting an understanding as well. So thank you for your time. And again, for those who don't know and who are new, we don't pay, Howard, nobody pays us. We do this for free, and everybody's doing this really because we know we need to pass this knowledge on. Join us for future webinar topics. Tom, are you still with us by any chance? Do you have the topic for the next one? I think it's AML audits. Is that correct?
Yeah, I am here. We have two upcoming. First one being, as you said, AML and internal audit, which is on the 22nd of October. AML internal audit compliance expectations and best practices. And then about a month later, towards the end of November, we have monitoring and periodic reviews, strengthening your AML framework.
Yes, and that's a very good topic, actually, because I think so many of us, we forget to, it seems to be like a honorable mention in our manuals. So those will both be very, very good. So again, Howard, thank you very much for your time today. I'm sure I will have you back and we'll be speaking again, because this is going to be a continuing, I think, pattern is what we're going to see. And I think Venezuela sorry, go ahead.
Nope, I just want to say another shout out to Castellum for those really cool and informative slides, which really helped me back up pages and pages or slides and slides of text. Yeah. So yeah, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. I try to repost really good content when I see it. And yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, Kimberly.
Thank you again, and thank you as well to the audience. You guys are amazing for listening in, and your constant learning. This, because we have to stay very much aware of everything that's going on, and it is changing, and support each other. And I'm happy to be a part of that support system for you. So thank you for your hard work as well. I know many of you are very overwhelmed and exhausted, and again, just know that we're doing everything we can to support you with your ongoing learning needs. Okay, and thank you for your hard work. Okay, bye-bye.